The story begins not in joy, but in the cold silence of a courtroom. 60-year-old Clara Johnson, a black woman who had spent her life in sacrifice, stood in chains. Her voice cracked, but her words cut through the air. "This society is far too unjust." Whispers filled the benches. Eyes judged her, and the gavel was ready to fall. Yet what no one in that room could imagine was that the very children she once lifted from despair would return, grown and unshaken, to fight for her freedom. Before we uncover this remarkable journey of compassion and redemption, I want to hear from you. If you were standing where Clara stood, would you still choose kindness in a world that showed you none? Share your thoughts below. Let us know where you are watching from, and may your day be filled with strength and light. The night in Rivertown had fallen with a weight heavier than usual, as if the air itself carried the remnants of judgment and weariness from the day. It was late winter, and the factory chimneys on the edge of town exhaled smoke into the dark sky, mixing with rain that streaked the lamplight into blurred halos. Clara Johnson, 60 years old, wrapped her faded brown coat tighter around her thin frame as she walked home from Douglas's laundry shop. She was a widow of many years, her hands roughened by soap and steam, her back bent from carrying baskets, her eyes steady from a lifetime of holding in words she could not afford to say. The narrow street smelled of wet stone and gasoline, and though her steps were tired, she carried herself with a dignity that no storm could wash away. Douglas, her employer, was a man in his mid-50s with pressed shirts and a face drawn tight from years of small cruelties. He wore his thinning gray hair slicked back, his jaw perpetually clenched, his tie too stiff for kindness. He valued order and speed, and often mocked Clara for being too slow or too stubborn. To him, she was just another cog in his shop, useful as long as she worked without protest, expendable if she faltered. Earlier that evening, he had kept her late, scolding her with clipped words while she folded stacks of shirts. By the time she left, her shoulders ached and her shoes were damp, but she knew there was no point in replying to a man who thrived on belittling others. The rain grew heavier as Clara turned down Mill Street, the sound of it drumming against rusted awnings and pooling in broken pavement. The old bus depot stood at the corner, a forgotten structure with boarded windows and graffiti-stained walls, long abandoned after the roots were cut back. Clara often passed by quickly, avoiding the shadows where trouble sometimes waited. But that night, something stopped her. A faint, uneven sound, softer than crying, yet sharper than the rain. She paused under the dim glow of a streetlight, straining her ears, and realized the sound came from within the depot. Every instinct told her to keep walking, that nothing good waited in such places. Yet a tug in her chest urged her forward, the same instinct that had once guided her to lift stray kittens from the gutter or tuck a coin into the palm of a hungry child. Inside the depot, beneath the cracked schedule board, two small figures huddled together on a broken bench. The boy, no older than 5, sat upright with his thin arms wrapped protectively around a smaller girl. His hair, the color of wheat darkened by rain, clung to his forehead, and his sneakers were worn to threads. His pale face was tight with effort, his smoky blue eyes guarded and older than they should have been. The girl, 3 years old, had tangled curls plastered to her cheeks, her lips dry and her small body trembling in the cold. She clutched a cracked plastic bracelet in her tiny hand as if it were a shield. The boy's eyes met Clara's, wary and silent, while the girl turned toward her with the faint whimper of someone too tired to cry any longer. Clara's knees protested as she knelt before them, but she ignored the pain, letting her voice soften into the kind of gentleness that could cross barriers. Fear had built. "Are you two alone?" she asked quietly. The boy said nothing at first, then after a long pause whispered his name, Ethan, and nodded toward his sister Lily. His voice cracked as he explained that their mother had gone and not come back, that the bus they had waited for never arrived, and that the night had become too big for them to face. Lily only whispered, "I'm thirsty," holding up her bracelet-marked wrist as if that were explanation enough. Clara pulled off her scarf, wrapping it around their shivering shoulders, feeling their small bodies tremble beneath the fabric. Her eyes drifted to the rusted payphone hanging on the wall, its cord twisted but still intact. With deliberate steps, she lifted the receiver and called the social services hotline, her voice steady as she gave the dispatcher the details. The woman on the other end, Miss. Hernandez sounded kind but weary, apologizing that the shelters were full and the intake center was overwhelmed. "We can send a car," she said, "but they'll be placed in a group shelter out of town." It's crowded, noisy, not much more than cots lined in rows. Clara listened, her eyes fixed on the children's faces. Ethan's jaw tightened at the word shelter, and Lily buried her face against her brother's shoulder, her small frame trembling harder. Clara thanked the dispatcher, her voice polite, but when she hung up, she already knew the answer she would give. The rain tapped a rhythm on the tin roof, each drop a reminder of the choice pressing down on Clara's shoulders. She thought of her apartment on Dawson Street, the peeling wallpaper, the single rattling heater, the pantry with only a few cans of soup and a loaf of bread. She thought of Douglas's cruel smirk, of the gossip in the neighborhood, of the weight of mouths to feed when her own wages barely kept the lights on. But she also thought of her late husband's words, long ago, that a person is measured not by what they keep, but by what they give. Looking into Ethan's frightened eyes and Lily's small, trembling hands, Clara knew she could not let them disappear into a shelter where they would become just two more forgotten names on a list. She crouched lower, steadying her voice so it carried the calm she wanted them to feel. "Come with me," she said. Ethan hesitated, his lips pressing thin, but when Lily slipped her hand into Clara's calloused palm, his resistance broke. Clara gathered the blanket around them, lifted Lily with the practiced care of someone who had once dreamed of grandchildren, and led Ethan by the hand. Together they stepped out into the storm, the rain hissing at their ankles, the street lamps guiding them toward the fragile warmth of her home. Her building was an old walk-up with narrow stairs and hallways that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp carpet. Neighbors peeked from behind cracked doors, their eyes sharp with curiosity. "That fool woman," one man muttered, shaking his head. "She can't feed herself, now she drags in strays." Another whispered, "A black widow with white children? It'll end badly, mark my words." Clara heard the words as she always did, but she kept walking, her chin high, the children close. She opened her small apartment and ushered them inside. The heater clattered but pushed out warmth, the plaid blanket on the couch welcomed their small frames, and a pot of broth on the stove filled the room with the scent of comfort. Ethan ate slowly at first, his eyes darting, while Lily devoured spoonfuls as if she had not tasted food in days. As the children settled beneath blankets and their breathing softened into sleep, Clara sat in the corner of the room, rubbing her aching knees, watching them. She knew tomorrow her life would change in ways she could not yet predict. There would be questions, judgments, and sacrifices sharper than any she had made before. But she also knew one truth that no gossip could erase: those children would not sleep on cold concrete while she still drew breath. Outside, the rain eased into a steady drizzle, but inside her apartment, a quiet decision had been made, one that would echo far louder than the storm. The winter air in Rivertown did not forgive, and mornings came with a gray light that slid across rooftops blackened by smoke, settling on narrow alleys where people hurried without looking up. Clara rose each day before the radiator stirred, slipping into worn shoes and wrapping her patched coat tight, her mind already measuring the few coins in her purse against the many needs of two small children. Ethan and Lily had been with her only a short time, yet their laughter now filled the Dawson Street apartment, making its peeling wallpaper feel less like decay and more like witness to a new beginning. Clara divided bread into 3 portions, placed one orange on the table as though it were gold, and walked the children toward the church on Elm Avenue, her chin lifted against the cold stares of neighbors who opened doors only far enough to whisper. The church was a lifeline, its paint chipped and its floorboards creaking, but the fellowship hall smelled of coffee and faith. Reverend Morris, in his 70s with soft jowls and glasses perched low, welcomed Clara without pity, writing her name in the ledger as if every family carried dignity. Mrs. Bell, the pantry matron with a stern voice but eyes quick to kindness, slipped food into Clara's hands: a sack of rice, a tin of beans, sometimes a pair of donated shoes polished enough to be worn with pride. On lucky days, a bright orange or two, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, sat on top like a secret treasure. Clara whispered her thanks, not for herself but for the children waiting at home, and walked out with the bag hugged close, a shield against shame. Education was the currency Clara prized most, and she bartered her pride for it gladly. Each morning, Ethan sat in a semicircle at the church reading circle, his blonde head bent low as volunteers coaxed letters into words. Lily, barely 3, copied the strokes of older children with fierce determination, her curls shaking with concentration. Clara often lingered by the doorway long enough to see them settled, then hurried to Douglas's laundry with the quick steps of someone who could not afford lateness. She told herself that while wages bought bread, learning bought tomorrow, and though tomorrow was uncertain, it was the only wealth she could pass on. Evenings transformed their small kitchen into a classroom, the wobbly table covered in papers saved from the laundry. Ethan, serious beyond his years, traced letters with a stub of pencil, his tongue poking from the corner of his mouth, whispering sounds until they became words. When he managed to read a full sentence, his blue eyes turned to Clara, and her nod filled him with a pride that no hunger could steal. Lily, stubborn and eager, filled her paper with crooked L's, announcing each with triumph, and Clara kissed the crown of her head, declaring that the letters were ladders she would climb. The wall above the table soon bore a gallery of scribbles and halting sentences, each taped like a banner of victory. At the laundry, however, the air was heavy with bleach and disdain. Douglas prowled the aisles with his tie knotted too tightly, his gray hair slicked back to a shine, his lips curling whenever Clara passed. He liked an audience, and his voice rang out one afternoon, sharp enough to slice through steam. "Ba tung nui duk tu na sao, they'll turn on you the first chance they get," he sneered, and the younger workers chuckled nervously while older ones bent their heads in silence. Clara kept pressing collars, her wrists steady, her silence not submission, but resistance. She carried in her mind the sound of Ethan reading aloud and Lily laughing at her scribbles, and those memories built a wall stronger than Douglas's cruelty. Rivertown's stairwells carried gossip as easily as footsteps, and judgment echoed louder than hymns. A woman in a fur-trimmed hood announced at the grocer that a black widow raising white children was unnatural. A man on the stoop muttered that some people collected strays for attention, puffing smoke into the winter air like punctuation. Even in church pews, where forgiveness should have softened tongues, whispers questioned Clara's motives. Ethan noticed the stares and pulled his shoulders back like a small soldier, while Lily pressed her hand tighter into Clara's, asking why people spoke that way. Clara crouched to their level, her voice steady but aching, and said, "They don't understand us yet." Amid the scorn, kindness slipped in quietly. Mrs. Rose, a widow past 60 with silver hair tied in a bun and cardigans that smelled faintly of lavender, lived in the apartment below. She rarely joined the gossip, her words few and careful. But on Thursday nights, Clara would find a paper bag at her door. Half a loaf of bread, 3 apples wrapped in newspaper, or a jar of pickled beets that stained her fingers red. Once Clara caught her in the act, and Rose, eyes lowered, murmured, "Bread keeps better when it's shared," before retreating down the stairs. The food filled their bellies, but the gesture filled Clara's spirit with a warmth that no soup pot could provide. There were nights when triumph outweighed hunger. Ethan returned from the library with a primer, reading a full page aloud while Lily clapped so hard her crayon rolled away. Clara's eyes stung with tears as she listened, not from sadness, but from joy so fierce it made fatigue vanish. Another night, Lily filled a sheet with bold L's, announcing her name with pride, and Clara taped it to the wall beside her brother's work. They ate thin soup with laughter so rich it turned scarcity into abundance, and when Clara tucked them in, she whispered prayers of gratitude for 2 small lives entrusted to her. Yet cruelty found its way in through other children's mouths, echoing words they had overheard. Ethan came home from the park with a red mark on his cheek, his shoulders hunched, telling how another boy mocked him for being raised by a black woman. Lily returned one day with her drawing torn in half, the sun ripped across its middle like a wound, and she sobbed until Clara smoothed the pieces and mended them with tape. "Broken things can still be beautiful when cared for," she whispered, and Lily nodded through tears. Later, when the children slept, Clara sat alone at the table, her head bowed, allowing grief to wash through before she lifted her face and prepared for tomorrow. Douglas's contempt only sharpened with time. During a rush order, sweat steaming and tempers frayed, he sneered, "They'll grow up and leave you, and you'll be nothing but a foolish old woman with empty hands." The words clung to the air like poison, drawing laughter from some and silence from others. Clara lifted her eyes once, letting him see her steadiness, then bent again to her work. She knew his prediction was a lie, for she carried in her heart Ethan's careful sentences and Lily's determined lines, proof that love builds foundations deeper than prejudice. That night, after checking the blankets of 2 sleeping children, she whispered into the dark, "You are mine, and I will not let you go." Years gathered quietly in Rivertown, each one layering over the last like sheets of faded newsprint, and Clara found herself measuring time not by clocks or calendars, but by the progress of 2 children who had once arrived with nothing more than frightened eyes and empty hands. The Dawson Street apartment still carried the smell of soap and boiled tea, its wallpaper peeling at the corners, but now the walls were brightened by pages of schoolwork, photographs from ceremonies, and letters carefully pinned above the table. Clara's days remained simple working hours at the laundry, returning to evenings of letters and memories. But her heart grew full, for Ethan and Lily were no longer the small children she had once guided with a firm hand across icy streets. Ethan had become a young man with broad shoulders and a face marked by earnest determination, his blonde hair neatly combed, his eyes still carrying the intensity of a boy who once bent over a primer with trembling lips. He had earned top marks through high school, often staying awake deep into the night with his textbooks spread across the kitchen table, while Clara brewed tea to keep him company. When the acceptance letter arrived, announcing a full scholarship to study law at a prestigious university in another state, Clara wept openly, clutching the paper as though it were a holy relic. Ethan promised to fight for justice, his voice steady as he told Clara he would return stronger, and she kissed his forehead, whispering that he already had. Lily, softer in voice but fiercer in spirit, discovered her gift with words almost as naturally as breathing. She scribbled stories on the backs of grocery lists, filled margins of her notebooks with observations about neighbors and streets, and once wrote a short essay about Clara's strength that won first prize at school. Teachers praised her sharp mind and fearless pen, and soon another letter arrived, this one carrying news of a scholarship in journalism that would take her overseas. Clara's heart swelled with pride and ache in equal measure, for the thought of letting Lily fly across oceans brought both joy and longing. Lily hugged her tightly, promising that every story she told would carry a piece of Clara within it, and Clara believed her with all the faith of a mother. The apartment walls became a gallery of connection. Each letter that arrived, Ethan writing of courtroom lectures and case studies, Lily describing bustling city streets and the thrill of chasing stories, was carefully unfolded and pinned above the table. Clara read them nightly, her fingers tracing the words until the ink nearly smudged, and in those lines she found strength for the mornings when her body ached more than it once had. Neighbors who once gossiped now fell silent when passing by her door, for the evidence of success was undeniable. The old widow, with little more than will, had raised 2 children who were rewriting their futures. Clara did not speak of vindication. She only smiled when asked, her pride tucked quietly into the corners of her heart. Douglas, however, could not hide the bitterness that grew inside him like mold on damp walls. He remained in charge of the laundry, though his posture had stooped with age and his sharpness had soured into cruelty without edge. His own son, Paul, a man in his 20s with careless hair and an air of entitlement, spent nights in taverns, wasting money on cards and cheap whiskey, returning home with debts and excuses. The contrast cut Douglas deeply. His lineage, meant to carry on his name, was stumbling, while the 2 strays of that old black woman were rising into places his son would never touch. He muttered venom beneath his breath, sneered louder at Clara when she passed, but the sting of his words no longer found purchase. Clara had weathered storms greater than envy. Ethan's letters often spoke of debates, of professors who challenged him, of the weight of responsibility he carried when standing to defend a case study. Clara imagined him in lecture halls with oak-paneled walls, his voice steady as he argued for fairness, and she smiled through her weariness, knowing the boy who once struggled with letters was now mastering laws. Lily's letters painted vivid pictures of foreign streets filled with languages she did not yet know but was determined to learn, of editors who admired her courage, and of stories that gave voice to those who were ignored. Clara read them aloud to herself, her voice trembling with pride, and the apartment filled with echoes of distant places that now belonged, in part, to her. Yet Clara's body was not immune to time's demands. The pain in her knees grew sharper, and the stiffness in her hands made simple tasks heavier than they once were. She felt the ache when rising from bed, when climbing the stairs, when lifting laundry at work. But she carried it in silence, unwilling to burden Ethan and Lily with worry. When neighbors asked why she moved slower, she brushed it aside with a smile, saying age was only settling in. At night, alone, she rubbed ointment into her joints, whispering prayers for strength to last long enough to see her children's dreams fulfilled. The pain was a secret pact she made with herself, to endure quietly so their wings could spread without guilt. Mrs. Rose remained a steady presence, her kindness aging alongside Clara's endurance. The widow, still carrying baskets of bread and jars of preserves, now knocked openly before leaving gifts, unashamed of her loyalty. She scolded Clara gently for working too much, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the stiffness in Clara's movements. But Clara only laughed softly, saying, "Old wood creaks but still holds the house." Rose, knowing better, squeezed her hand in silence, their friendship forged in shared loneliness and small acts of rebellion against a world too ready to dismiss them. The pride Clara carried was quiet but unshakable. She walked past the laundry with her head high, ignoring Douglas's mutters, her gaze fixed on the memory of Ethan's determined eyes and Lily's fearless pen. The neighborhood, once filled with whispers of disdain, now watched her with reluctant respect, for it was impossible to deny the fruits of seeds planted long ago in faith and sacrifice. Clara did not seek their approval. She had already found her worth in the children who had grown into themselves. What mattered most was that the love she had given freely had returned as proof that kindness, when tended, becomes legacy. On evenings when the pain in her knees forced her to sit longer than she wished, Clara would rest in her chair, gazing at the letters on the wall, reading and rereading until the words blurred. She whispered their names, Ethan, Lily, as if they were prayers, and the sound filled the apartment like warmth from a fire. Though her body faltered, her spirit stood tall, carried by the knowledge that the children she had chosen her in return. Seeds once planted in hunger and prejudice were now strong roots, and Clara knew that even if her steps slowed, their paths would keep moving forward. Winter in Rivertown had hardened into a brittle season, the kind that creaked through window frames and carried whispers sharper than the wind itself. Clara walked slower these days, her knees aching with every step, yet she still carried herself with quiet dignity, clutching letters from Ethan and Lily as if they were lanterns against the dark. The walls of her apartment glowed with their words, hope pinned above peeling paint, but beneath that warmth, a shadow stirred. Douglas, embittered by his son's failures and consumed with envy at the successes of the two children Clara had raised, began to scheme with a bitterness that left no room for restraint. Douglas's ally emerged in the form of Harold Pike, the church's bookkeeper, a thin man in his 40s with spectacles that always seemed to catch the dim light and eyes that darted nervously, as though truth itself was a predator stalking him. Harold had debts from nights spent at card tables, and Douglas, ever keen to exploit weakness, offered him an escape, forge the ledgers, frame Clara for theft, and wipe his slate clean. It was a cruel arrangement sealed not with honor but with desperation, and together they doctored papers, shifting numbers and creating entries that made Clara appear as though she had siphoned charity funds into her own pocket. The irony was sharp. Douglas knew the woman he despised lived with barely enough for bread, yet he wanted her reputation broken more than he wanted his accounts balanced. The morning of her arrest arrived with sirens that shattered the thin stillness of Dawson Street. Two policemen, uniforms pressed and expressions cold, knocked sharply on Clara's door as neighbors peeked through curtains, eager for scandal. Word spread like fire on dry grass. The black widow who raised white children has been stealing from the church. Clara, bewildered and trembling, tried to explain, but the handcuffs bit into her wrists before her words could land. She was led down the narrow stairwell past doors that had once muttered gossip and now muttered satisfaction, the phrase, "I knew it," falling like ash behind her. Her head remained bowed, not in shame, but in disbelief at how swiftly a life of sacrifice could be twisted into suspicion. News traveled faster than compassion, and by evening the town was echoing with condemnation. Headlines on notice boards outside the grocer read, "Woman exploits charity funds." At the tavern, men clinked glasses, nodding with false wisdom, while at the market, women shook their heads as if betrayal were inevitable. For Clara, the harshest blow came not from strangers, but from the memory of Ethan and Lily. She pictured them reading such headlines, their proud letters to her stained by scandal. That night in the cold holding cell, she pressed her palms together and whispered a plea that they would never hear of this, that their futures would remain unshadowed by lies crafted by bitter men. When Mrs. Rose came to visit, carrying nothing but her determined presence, Clara's mask finally cracked. Sitting across from her in the visiting room, her hands trembling, Clara begged, "Don't tell the children, Rose. They have their futures ahead. Let them keep their light, even if mine has gone dark." Rose, her silver hair pulled back in its familiar bun and her eyes moist with compassion, gripped Clara's hand through the bars, promising to protect that secret as best she could. She had no power to undo the charges, but she could shield Ethan and Lily for a little while longer. And in that promise, Clara found a flicker of relief. The courthouse was a place Clara had only known from stories and television screens, but now its cold marble steps felt like a climb into exile. Inside, the ceiling arched high with self-importance, and the benches filled with townspeople eager to see judgment fall. Douglas sat among them, his smirk thinly disguised as concern, while Harold Pike avoided her gaze, his spectacles fogging as guilt gnawed at him. Clara's clothes were plain, her scarf tied neatly as always, her posture stooped from pain yet steady with the resolve of someone who knew the truth, even if no one else would. Every glance she received was sharp, each whisper cutting deeper than the handcuffs ever had. The prosecution painted her as a cunning thief who had exploited sympathy, their voices steady as they presented forged documents, signatures, and false testimonies. Witnesses claimed to have seen her handle envelopes she never touched, and Harold, sweating under the weight of his own lies, nodded at each fabricated account. Clara kept her eyes lowered, her heart pounding, but her voice silent, for what words could dismantle a structure built so carefully against her? She felt the weight of the community's scorn pressing down, the knowledge that decades of kindness had been erased by the stroke of a pen. Rose sat in the back of the courtroom, her small frame almost swallowed by the oak benches, but her presence was a pillar Clara leaned on invisibly. The widow's eyes never left her, silently reminding her that she was not entirely abandoned. Yet even Rose could not silence the sting of judgment. From every corner came murmurs. We trusted her. She fooled us all. A black woman stealing from God's house. What did we expect? Clara let the words pass through her, though each one left a bruise no one could see. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering Ethan's and Lily's names to herself, summoning their memory as armor. As the trial drew toward its end, tension thickened in the room. The judge, an older man with deep lines etched by years of verdicts, adjusted his glasses and prepared to speak. The prosecution had laid out its story neatly, the defense weak in the face of manufactured evidence, and the townspeople leaned forward with anticipation. Clara's shoulders sagged under the weight of inevitability, her breath shallow, her hands clenched together on the table. She believed this was the end, that everything she had built was about to collapse, that the children she loved would remember her not for her sacrifice, but for the shame others had painted on her. Then the gavel hovered in the judge's hand, and silence fell across the courtroom like a heavy curtain. Every eye was fixed on him, every breath caught in the cage of suspense. Clara kept her gaze lowered, bracing for the blow of a life destroyed, while Douglas leaned forward with the hunger of a man ready to taste victory. The moment stretched unbearably, each second an eternity of judgment waiting to be spoken. In that breathless pause, the entire town seemed to hold its lungs. The fate of a woman who had given everything now balanced on the edge of a single word. The silence in the Rivertown courtroom was thick enough to hear the shuffle of shoes and the faint hum of the overhead lights, every eye fixed on the judge whose gavel hovered in the air. Clara sat hunched at the defendant's table, her scarf tied neatly, her hands folded as if in prayer, believing this was the moment her life would end in shame. Douglas leaned forward in his seat, his lips curved in a smirk sharpened by years of spite, certain that victory was finally his. But just as the gavel began its descent, the heavy doors creaked open, and the sudden echo pulled every head toward the entrance. Standing there, framed by cold winter light, were Ethan and Lily. Ethan entered first, tall and steady, his blonde hair combed neatly, his suit crisp though worn at the edges, his law book still evident in the squared set of his shoulders. Beside him walked an older man, his mentor, a seasoned attorney with silver at his temples and a briefcase that seemed to carry the weight of experience. Lily followed close behind, her curls looser now, her coat still dusted with the frost of foreign airports, and in her hand she clutched a small recorder, the red light glowing like a promise. The air inside the courtroom shifted. Whispers rippled across the benches, for everyone recognized the children once mocked as strays, now returning with strength. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her eyes filling with tears she dared not let fall. The judge paused, gavel still raised, his brows furrowed. "Who interrupts these proceedings?" he demanded, his voice stern but edged with curiosity. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm and clear, resonant with the confidence of both training and conviction. "Your Honor, I am Ethan Carter. I am the legal ward of Clara Johnson, and I stand here with counsel to provide evidence that proves her innocence." Gasps filled the room, the crowd leaning in as Ethan handed a stack of documents to the bailiff, his hand steady though his heart thundered in his chest. Clara's lips parted, the word son trembling on her tongue but never spoken, her pride eclipsed by awe. The prosecution tried to maintain control, insisting the case was already complete, but Ethan's words carried the sharp precision of a blade cutting through lies. He pointed out the inconsistencies in Harold Pike's testimony, the conflicting dates, the signatures that bore telltale signs of forgery. Each contradiction fell like a hammer against the carefully built wall of deceit, and witnesses faltered under his questions, their confidence unraveling. Douglas shifted uneasily in his chair, his smirk fading, his fingers drumming against the wood of the bench as though to summon a defense that would not come. The courtroom began to buzz with unease, the tide slowly turning. Lily stepped forward then, her small recorder raised, her voice steady though her heart pounded with righteous fire. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm Lily Carter, a journalist studying abroad. Before returning, I conducted an independent investigation into Mr. Douglas Harlan and his practices at the laundry." She handed forward copies of her article, crisp and damning, each page filled with evidence of wage theft, falsified accounts, and funds diverted for Douglas's personal use. The judge leafed through the pages, his expression tightening, while the crowd erupted into whispers that no gavel could silence. Lily's voice grew stronger, fueled by truth. The real crime was never committed by Clara Johnson. It was hidden behind Douglas's envy. Douglas's face reddened, his composure cracking under the weight of exposure. He barked denials, calling Lily a liar, Ethan a fraud, but his words rang hollow against the hard evidence laid bare before the court. Harold Pike, sweating in the witness stand, finally broke under the pressure, admitting through trembling lips that he had altered the books at Douglas's request. The courtroom gasped, some people rising to their feet, the once whispered judgments against Clara, now turned against the man who had engineered them. Douglas's fury spilled over, his voice rising, but each denial only deepened the truth of his guilt. He was cornered, and the walls of his deception collapsed. The judge struck his gavel hard, demanding order as the room threatened to erupt into chaos. His voice carried the authority of decades spent balancing justice. This court finds that the evidence presented against Clara Johnson was falsified. The charges are dismissed. Mrs. Johnson is innocent. For a moment the room held its breath. Then applause thundered, echoing against the wooden walls. Neighbors who once sneered now lowered their heads, their shame as visible as their former contempt. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they had witnessed a story that would travel beyond Rivertown's narrow borders. Clara bowed her head, her shoulders shaking with relief she had thought never to feel again. Lily crossed the floor before anyone else could move, tears streaking her face as she threw her arms around Clara, crying out, "Mom!" The word rang through the courtroom, filling every corner with its truth, a declaration not just of love, but of belonging made public at last. Clara held her tightly, her body trembling, her heart soaring as though the years of sacrifice had finally bloomed in a single moment. Ethan placed his hand firmly on Clara's shoulder, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Everything you planted has come to flower, Mother," he said, and his words were both verdict and blessing. The room softened with silence, as though even the walls understood the weight of what had been spoken. Those who had mocked Clara now looked away, some wiping their eyes, others whispering apologies too late to matter. Mrs. Rose, seated in the back, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, smiling through her tears as she witnessed the vindication of her friend. The judge himself nodded gravely, a small sign of respect toward a woman whose dignity had endured longer than any accusation. Outside, bells from the church tower began to toll, their sound carried into the courthouse like an anthem of justice. Clara straightened slowly, her back no longer bent under the weight of falsehoods, her chin lifted high, her eyes shimmering with tears that spoke of both pain and triumph. Around her, the applause continued, but within her heart a quieter song rose, the knowledge that kindness, once sown, never dies. It waits, it grows, and it returns at the moment it is most needed. The circle of compassion had closed, proving to all who had doubted that love is the truest justice. Clara left the courthouse that day with Ethan and Lily at her side, her steps steady, her spirit unbroken. Her story no longer one of survival alone, but of victory earned through sacrifice and faith. In the end, the story of Clara reminds us that true greatness does not come from wealth, power, or recognition, but from compassion lived quietly and sacrifices carried without complaint. She showed that even in a world clouded by prejudice, kindness can take root, grow in silence, and return at the very moment it is most needed. Her life tells us that love is stronger than lies, that dignity can outlast cruelty, and that no act of mercy is ever wasted. For everyone watching, may this story be an invitation to believe in goodness again, to treat one another with humanity, and to honor those who carry silent burdens with courage. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who may need encouragement today, and write in the comments what this lesson means to you. May God bless you and your family, and may compassion guide your path.